Good afternoon, everybody. We are so happy to have our first global webinar series on UMKC-MODERN Money Theory, Economic Policy and Full Employment Program Requirements for Recovery in the Global North and Global South during the COVID pandemic. This time, this webinar is sponsored by CISAN and also by the Center for Research on by the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And the Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is representing this center, and myself represent the Center of International Research on North America. It's the first one. We try to do it in English, so but anyway, we are so happy that you are here, and we thank our authorities at UNAM and at the CISAN. So Fadhel, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Claudia. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for helping with the setup for this event. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison University, and I'm the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And it's a pleasure to be included in this event. We wanted to have a conversation today about the big macroeconomic policy issues that are facing countries in the global south, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. But we also wanted to highlight that a lot of the structural issues that we're dealing with right now during the pandemic have existed for a long time, and the pandemic simply exacerbated a lot of these problems. And there's a particular take that we're bringing to the table today with this webinar, which is modern monetary theory, the approach of MMT, or the MMT lens, analytical lens that we're trying to apply in the context of the global south. So all of us in this webinar today went to grad school together at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and which is the place where a lot of the original MMT ideas have been developed. But as many people know, the original MMT literature was primarily focused on the global north, on the United States, Canada, Australia, and many of us graduate students at the time coming from developing countries were questioning and engaging critically with this literature and the development of these ideas. And now, maybe I should say, a couple of decades later, several of us from the graduate program at UMKC and other places have been developing new ideas to help us understand the nuances of economic development in the global south from an MMT perspective. And this is kind of what we wanted to showcase today. And if we are fortunate, we will have my dear friend JAIRO PARADA from Colombia with us if his internet connection holds. And we were also hoping to have with us SHAKUNTALA from India, but it appears that the weather conditions are extremely bad today, and electricity and the internet is down in her region. So we may or may not be able to have her with us in this webinar. And with that, we're also fortunate to have our colleague, also UMKC alumni, KAROL Gil Vasquez, who will chair this panel, this webinar with us today. So without any further ado, KAROL, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Fadhel, and thank you for this great opportunity. I coincide with what you just mentioned. You know, students at the time from the global south trying to make sense of ideas of a global north. So I think this is a great opportunity to do that. So please allow me to introduce Fadhel, Dr. Kaboub, who's gonna have the first presentation. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliation with the Levy Economic Institute and John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the job guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, build resilience, and promote equitable, and sustainable prosperity. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Le Monde, and France 24. You can follow him on Twitter at Fadhel Kaboub and at GISP tweets. So please, Fadhel, join us. Please, Fadhel, join us. And just basic rules, 25 minutes for, well, we're probably gonna give more time for each presenter. And then we will take the questions at the end of our session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. And if you could confirm you see my screen, my PowerPoint, right? Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Thank you. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to use the case study of my home country, Tunisia, for purposes of illustration today in this presentation. And the title of this presentation, as you can see, is MMT-Informed Strategies for Prosperity, Resilience, and Sovereignty in Tunisia. So with that, I'm going to start with kind of a diagnosis exercise. And this is a diagnosis exercise for the Tunisian economy, but it's really relevant to many, many countries in the global south. So the core economic problems that we're dealing with are structural trade deficits that lead to high levels of external debt, and Tunisia is facing a debt crisis as we speak. That is a government debt denominated in foreign currencies, dollars and euros and Japanese yen and so on, rather than kind of domestic government debt. And the major root causes of these structural deficits and the external debt are three components that I'd like to highlight today. One is energy deficits. We import a lot of energy, that is fossil fuels in particular. Two, lack of food sovereignty. We import a lot of food. And three, it's a structural problem with the type of industrialization that Tunisia and most developing countries have pursued, which essentially creates a situation whereby you specialize in the manufacturing of low value added content. So you export low value added content and you import high value added content. So you're constantly trapped in that vicious cycle. And when you have these structural problems, the trade deficit puts pressure, downward pressure on the currency relative to the dollar, to the euro. So naturally, anything you would import the next day with a devalued currency will be more expensive, whether it's food or fuel or medicine or basic necessities. And that could lead to social and political instability. We've seen this in Tunisia, we've seen this in Lebanon right now, and Egypt and other places with food riots and social instability. And that kind of forces the government into two options: either accept the instability and the chaos, or step in and borrow more dollars and euros to artificially fix the exchange rate, stabilize the exchange rate, and perpetuate that vicious cycle of external debt without really addressing the structural problems. It's simply a Band-Aid solution to muddle through. And that's really part of the problem. Just to illustrate here, this is, as you can see, 1972 is when Tunisia pursued free trade policies. And the idea was to pursue export-led growth. And it turns out the more you try to export, the more you have to import in terms of capital and intermediate goods and energy to fuel the industrialization process. And that's been a permanent problem. The flip side of it is the tremendous increase in external debt over the years. It slows down every now and then, but it's really a consistent trend that is unsustainable. Now, when you look at the composition of the value-added content of what we export versus what we import, this is kind of a quick color-coded picture to give you a sense of what Tunisia exports. Primarily, it's a lot of textiles, lots of kind of raw materials, olive oil and things like that, and lots of components for manufacturing in the European economies, such as electrical wires and kind of components that go into further assembly line, and lots of fuel to fuel the economy. On the imports, the exports are crude oil quite a bit. But then we import the higher value-added version of crude oil, which is refined petrochemicals, the gasoline and kerosene and other petrochemicals that are more expensive than the crude, of course. Lots of food imports, especially wheat, and then everything else in terms of medical equipment and high-tech equipment and computers and medicine and so on. So that's typical. Tunisia's case is not as bad as many other developing countries, but it's not unusual to see huge discrepancy between the value-added content of exports and imports. So what does mainstream economic policy tell us developing countries should do? Austerity, debt restructuring, privatize state-owned companies. Well, the problem with privatizing state-owned companies, once you sell the airport, once you sell the airline, you can't privatize it again. Once you sell the water company, you spend the money and you're done. Labor market flexibility. This is the coded language for, a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards, wages, and protection of workers and so on. Foreign direct investment and export-led growth. We're told that this is the way to drive industrialization, except the only type of FDI you can attract, the only type of export-led manufacturing you're able to sustain tends to be low value-added content, so you're constantly losing in that battle. Financial liberalization leads to speculative bubbles. Claudia will probably talk about that a little bit later. Tourism is often viewed as the thing that will save the economy. Why? Because it creates a lot of jobs and it brings foreign currency reserves into the country. Well, that is true, but it turns out that the millions of tourists that you bring into the country, you have to feed them, so you end up importing more food. You have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels for them, so you have to import even more fuel, which means the net impact of tourism in terms of foreign currency reserves may not be actually positive because of all the additional costs associated with importing additional food and fuel and other subsidies. So it's not a sustainable solution. Remittances, we're told that this is a way to help boost the foreign currency reserves at the central bank and so on, but that's fueled by brain drain. This is not really a development strategy. So we end up with a race to the bottom, more external debt, and we're told that there's no alternative. You just have to live within your means and so on. So for me, this is the trap that we need to escape. The only way out of this trap is to invest in productive capacity to address those structural weaknesses. That is, if a major source of your external debt is fuel imports, you need to invest in renewable energy. If a major source of your imports and your external debt is food imports, you need to invest in sustainable agriculture, water and energy management and conservation policies. And if the manufacturing model that you've been following since the 60s and 70s is leading to that trap, then you need to rethink your international trade and industrialization policy via South-South strategic partnerships, which I'll come back to in a little bit and address in more detail. Focusing on value-added industrial policy, implementing a job guarantee to reclaim economic and monetary sovereignty, which I'll elaborate on in a second, and moving away from export-led growth, FDI-led growth, and focusing on employment-led growth to build productive capacity in strategic areas, especially food and energy, and always focusing on the value-added content of what you're producing and how much it adds to the resilience of your economy, resilience to external shocks. So can we afford it? Who's going to pay for it? Where does all this money come to redesign the economy and invest in infrastructure that is needed? Education, research and development, technology, and so on. Where does the money come from? This is where the MMT lens becomes helpful. So here's a brief introduction to MMT, or modern monetary theory, and then I'll apply it in the context of Tunisia. So in MMT, we always talk about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. That is to say, not all countries have the same spending capacity. And what determines whether you're a country that has no monetary sovereignty whatsoever on this end of the spectrum versus a country like the US or Japan or the UK that has very high degree of monetary sovereignty is going to be a number of factors. But to illustrate here, to give you an example, countries with no monetary sovereignty would be countries that have dollarized their economy completely, such as Ecuador, for example, or countries that have given up a national currency or never had a national currency, like the CFA franc zone in Africa, former French colonies, and so on. What will determine where you sit on this spectrum of monetary sovereignty are going to be four components. One, whether you have your own national currency. which you spend into existence and tax the population into that national currency. And number two, whether you issue debt denominated in the national currency only or in the national currency plus foreign currencies. So think of the US and Japan, for example, just to illustrate. The entire national debt stock of the United States is in US dollars. So the US doesn't have any external debt denominated in foreign currencies. The same is true in Japan. Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, 265% last time I checked. The entire debt stock is in Japanese yen. However, developing countries, for those structural reasons that I highlighted earlier, are forced into a corner, so to speak, and are forced to borrow in foreign currencies. And once you do that, you lose a certain degree of monetary sovereignty, which means your fiscal spending capacity becomes constrained. So, and here's a quick summary of what I just said. You issue your own currency, you tax in your own currency, you only issue debt denominated in the national currency, which means you operate under a flexible exchange rate regime as opposed to a fixed exchange rate regime with the dollar or with gold or anything else. Now, that is to say that MMT makes a distinction between currency users and currency issuers. Developing countries who borrow in dollars and euros and Japanese yen and British pounds become users of foreign currencies, which means they have to operate in a fiscally conservative framework because they have to earn the income in order to pay their debts. Whereas countries that don't have external debt are much more flexible in terms of their spending capacity. Doesn't mean they have infinite spending capacity. They're constrained, but it's not the same financial constraint. And the key here is, this is for sovereign government. Don't try this at home. This is not for households or firms and so on, or states and municipalities at the local level. So here's the question about the limit of how much sovereign governments can spend, both in the global north and the global south. And I'll zoom in on the global south. We're told from a mainstream perspective that too much spending and too much borrowing will cause inflation. So we need to be kind of fiscally disciplined. We only spend up to the tax revenues and maybe up to whatever markets will allow us to borrow. So we're always disciplined by markets. What MMT is saying is that there's this additional fiscal spending capacity that we're not tapping into. It's not infinite. Excuse me. Notice that it's constrained, it's limited by that red bar, the inflation risk. And to me, the risk of inflation is really what determines the ultimate spending capacity of the government. And it is determined by two factors. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, do you have the capacity to produce more food, more energy, more medical services, and so on? The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. You can employ millions of people to add productive capacity. The second limit to that inflation risk is what I call abusive price setting behavior. That is to say, when you have key players in the economy who can raise prices and set the inflation risk for the rest of the economy simply because they can or because we let them, because we're not enforcing antitrust laws, because the market is not competitive, because there's a lot of corruption and regulators are not doing what they're supposed to do. And that kind of inflation risk can't be eliminated with austerity. It can only be eliminated by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence, by tackling corruption and abuse in the system. This is extremely important in the global south. So that's really the paradigm shift that MMT is introducing. And this bright yellow space for most developing countries is small, but it can be expanded over time. So monetary sovereignty in the MMT sense is not something that you declare, by decree. It's something that you acquire through strategic policies, two sets of strategic policies. The more you build productive capacity, the more you expand that bright yellow space, the more you tackle corruption and abuse in the system, the more you expand the bright yellow space. So it's really about building up productive capacity, which means spending more, not spending less, investing in productive capacity. And that's really the counterintuitive part that most people outside the MMT framework can't really comprehend. And I'm going to spell it out for you here and show you what I mean. So what I'm saying is that increasing government spending can actually be used to fight inflation. Whereas in the mainstream, that doesn't make any sense. What? Increasing government spending to reduce inflation? Doesn't make sense. Here's how the mainstream framework thinks about this. If you increase government spending, let's say in Tunisia, I'm going to give you just a simple example. Let's say we decide we're going to increase spending by 2 billion dinars on health and education, very important areas. Here's how the mainstream approach will tell us what's going to happen. We're going to have more imports of food, energy, medical equipment, laptops, and so on. We're going to have larger trade deficit. We're going to have a weaker exchange rate. We're going to have a pass-through inflation effect, maybe even hyperinflation if we continue this forever. More external debt. The IMF and foreign lenders will step in and say, you need austerity, you can't keep doing this. We're going to have less investment in health and education with austerity policies. We're going to be back to square one with more unemployment, more brain drain, more social, economic, and political tensions. And we're essentially told there is no alternative. This is what Margaret Thatcher told us a long time ago. Don't even try this, spending more to fight inflation or spending more to create jobs. Now, here's the MMT approach to this. The same amount of money, 2 billion dinars on strategic areas, except what we're doing with the spending is that we're targeting spending in a different way. We're going to spend 1 billion dinars instead of 2. 1 billion dinars on health and education to increase domestic productive capacity in health and education. And then the second billion, we're going to spend it on the sources of inflation by building productive capacity in renewable energy and energy efficiency, and cracking down on corruption, abusive price setters, luxury goods via taxation and regulation. So spending the exact same amount, but the effects will be different. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to have fewer imports of food and energy, not more imports. So you're going to have lower trade deficit because these are the main sources of Tunisia's trade deficit. You're going to have a stable or even stronger exchange rate because you don't have that downward pressure on the exchange rate anymore. No inflation pass-through effect. You're going to have a lower external debt over time and higher credit rating by credit rating agencies. You're going to have an increase in foreign currency reserves at the central bank, and you're going to have more resilience to these external shocks because you have better food security and energy security. You're going to have a lower carbon footprint, more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for all with the exact same amount of spending. So you spend more to target the sources of inflation and build productive capacity. And once you discover this, now we're talking. So instead of spending 2 billion dinars in this way, it can be 3, it can be 4, it can be 7. What determines how much you can spend is not revenues or loans from the IMF. It's your capacity to strategically and effectively manage the administration, the execution of these plans. It's so you're not constrained in the same way that the mainstream is proposing. And then finally, I'm going to close with this slide on industrialization and international trade because it's critical for small developing countries. South-South strategic partnerships are extremely important because a small country like Tunisia with 11 or 12 million consumers, you can't really hit economies of scale to industrialize in the same way that a country like China or India or larger countries with larger access to markets can do. So what you do with a strategic block of global South partners, you will have larger markets that allow you to hit the level of economies of scale that you need. You have to focus on complementarity of resources and capabilities within the trading bloc. You start building horizontal linkages to increase value-added content within the bloc. So you focus on the collective resilience of the bloc strategically, especially starting with the foundations, because you can't have a functioning economy without food, without energy. These are the foundations before you build anything else. So you have to prioritize the collective resilience in terms of food sovereignty for the bloc, energy sovereignty for the bloc, especially renewables, water security, education, training, healthcare, and then you move from there. So you don't start by deciding to compete with Boeing and Airbus. You start with the foundation, with food security, with energy security, and so on. And this is how a country or a region acquires a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. And to me, if a country or a region lacks this basic level of resilience, it has no bargaining chips. Whether you're bargaining with the EU or with the US or with China, you just have to accept the terms and conditions of whatever they offer you in terms of loans or in terms of international trade agreements. Whereas when you have your food security, your energy security, you can walk away from a negotiation table if the terms are not favorable to you. Whereas right now, if you walk away, you have food riots the next day, and you have international sanctions and so on. So without this, countries will continue to lose economic and monetary sovereignty. And to me, this is really the contribution of the MMT lens for the Global South, is showing that there are structural weaknesses that need to be targeted with additional spending, not with less spending. And unfortunately, the mainstream approach leads us further into the trap, and other, quote unquote, progressive approaches tend to ignore the structural weaknesses and tend to ignore the capacity of the state to actually target those sources of inflation while building productive capacity and building resilience. And with that, I'm happy to take questions during the Q&A session, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with my colleagues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaboub. I really appreciate your remarks regarding the complexity of studying global South type of issues that are somehow very far away from the dynamics that are currently occurring in financial capitalism in the global North. So thank you very much for your remarks. They really bring light to me regarding macroeconomic issues. So this is time to introduce the following speaker. This is Professor JAIRO Parada Corrales. He is an economist from the University of Atlantic, or Universidad del Atlántico. He has master's studies from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Bogotá. He also has a master's in economics from Southern Illinois University. And in 2006, he earned his PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And currently he's a professor of the Universidad del Norte in Colombia. Professor Parada has published more than 35 articles and essays in national journals, regional and international journals. He has published a book and several chapters of a book, and he has participated in national, international, and global conferences. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. JAIRO Parada Corrales to this audience. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Carol. Thank you to Claudia and Fadhel. It's very nice to have you all here. Thank you for this invitation from CISAN and the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. I have a presentation here I'm going to share with you. And I hope that you can see it. Well, I'm going back a little bit to our story that I don't think Fadhel had the time to mention that. What about the crisis we are facing today? According to Mariana Mazzucato, the well-known heterodox economist, right now we are going through a triple crisis process. The health crisis that I think that was like not the cause, but the spark that ignited the crisis, generating a tremendous supplies and demand shock. And this is a very important issue today. We only a demand shock, but also we have a supply shock. The second issue is the economic crisis that was already in process during 2019 without any pandemic. So the world economy was slowing down and the pandemic just made things worse. And the third one, the climate crisis, that was ignored so far by the establishment, despite all the abundant rhetoric in books and papers, but not much in real public policy. And we are still in that problem. This crisis was the worst since 1929. I think that we were on the verge of a Great Depression. And the way the crisis has been faced is very important to underline because the expansionary fiscal of monetary policies helped to avoid the depression. And as Sidelsky said, the difference this time is that we knew Keynes. So Keynes gave us the tools to face this problem. The current crisis was not only a demand crisis, as I said before, but it's a supply one that has interrupted the supply chains that even today are affecting the recovery of international trade. Also, inflation is appearing today again in all countries. And this crisis has generated job losses of about 400 million jobs, and hysteresis is now affecting the current recovery. The world economy was hit deeply. I have this number from June 2021 that show the huge depressive month of last year, and now we are moving in some kind of a recovery process. But when you look at the numbers, this is a very long table. There is going to be a recovery this year, but it's going to be an unequal recovery because mostly developed nations will perform better this year and next year, and developed nation will be a little bit behind. And the conclusion is that a simple ARM molecule disrupted the world capitalist system. It's not an organism, it's just a molecule. The human domain and prevalence over nature was questioned. Market-driven economies didn't pay previous attention to possible pandemics that were announced 10 or more years ago, because it was not profitable to invest in social expenditure for something very much uncertain. Even economists, standard economists like Rodriguez said, neoliberalism is dying, but slowly. However, orthodox economics claim that these policy measures are just temporal, and we should return to business as usual very soon. In fact, Department of Economics throughout the world, they keep teaching the same thing. They keep transmitting the old neoclassical thesis like nothing has happened. Regarding MMT, which is our main issue, I think that this crisis brought us a window of opportunity for heterodox policies. When we were graduate students 20 years ago at UMKC, very nice to see you all today, very stick to these new theories. The basic proposals led by Randa Ray, built on Keynes, Lerner, Innes, and Knapp, appear somewhat strange, very strange to us, and out of any logic learned before in standard textbooks. And for students, even today, it's hard to understand and to accept these pieces. In that way, learning MMT was an intellectual challenge because it implied the removal of all neoclassical assumptions about money, ISLM Keynes, and full employment. I remember that the class taken by us with Ray, where we read and studied the general theory chapter by chapter. And I did the same with the doctoral class I had last year. And more than 200 papers helped to build this different approach of macropolicies. A correct vision on money is the key of this approach. However, in developing economies, macropolicies are still trapped in neoclassical dogmas. And the pandemic in some way helped to change things a little bit, but there is still a long way to go to overcome orthodoxy. This pandemic crisis forced all governments through the world to abandon rigid theories about fiscal budget constraints, crowding out myths, and fears of inflation. Governments with sovereign money rushed to run fiscal deficit to attend the crisis, putting checks on public hands, especially in developed nations. Nobody worried much about fiscal deficit during those months. However, in developing nations, the response was very limited and poor. The use of fiscal deficits to counter the effects of the pandemic didn't go over 5 or 9% of the GDP, compared with higher numbers in the OECD countries. It was claimed there were not fiscal resources. That was the main reason that most of this government gave, that they didn't have any fiscal resources to afford such expenditures, and tax reform were even implemented during the crisis. In Colombia, we had the tax reform in the middle of the crisis. Well, the result has been overwhelmingly negative. Have been very hard, increasing poverty, unemployment, and informality. Even proposals such as transitory basic income that were launched in many developing nations were rejected as populist and demagogic. The traditional neoclassical policies of targeted monetary aid to the poorest of the poor were implemented, were increased, and the price paid by these limited policies in terms of life and death has been huge. However, there have been criticisms of MMT. I would say there are two strands of criticism of MMT that has been exposed in the media. And I think the books written by Stephanie Kelton, the Deficit Myth, and Chorneva, our classmate, the Case for a Job Guarantee Program. There have been a lot of noise about these books. However, I think the discussion has been limited basically to the US and very much ignored in developing nations. I teach public economics, and my students are somewhat receptive to MMT, but most of them don't understand the main ideas as they have been indoctrinated previously in neoclassical macroeconomics. And regarding public opinion, when left-oriented political candidates, and we are seeing that in our country, touch the issues using the power of the state and the central bank to spend more, they are mocked as populist, irresponsible, and Maduro's followers that will take our country to a disaster like is happening now in Venezuela. Other criticisms, I would say that basically there are two strands. The orthodox view that distorts the MMT, alleging that the theory implies that deficit don't matter and real resource constraints are ignored, or that it's insane to assume that taxes don't drive spending and so on. And Ray has demolished these silly arguments. But also we have friendly fire coming from other PK schools and heterodox economists. Some of them still prisoners of the SHLM models. But the good thing about this critique is that some of them underline important topics that we need to address when we are dealing with developing nations, very much necessary to face the current pandemic. I don't have the time to go over this table, but PRAID 2020 draws an very interesting table comparing the position of post-Keynesians and neo-chartalists. And I would say there are very interesting issues proposed by the post-Keynesian that has to be taken into account. The main problem is the money, the sovereignty money. Press has this scheme that I think is very useful. When we don't have between the two extreme positions, the sovereign currency and non-sovereign currency, we have in the middle, as Kelton says, this is a spectrum of sovereignty. So the main discourses that have been elaborated in the US are referred to sovereign currency. What we need to do, and I think Fadhel is moving in that direction, is in the case of countries that they don't have this sovereign currency because they have this international reserve and governments IO, banks IO, and so on, but are depending on this international and monetary framework. Also, I would say that we have to be careful with MMT because it cannot be considered a holy grail for development. It is just a crucial macro policy that helps to diminish unemployment, but we need also real development policy. And Fadhel has been very broad in that, showing that we need to generate developmental states that promote industrialization and diversify export with a higher capital labor composition and not only primary products or commodities in a very extractive view that we have today in many developing nations. However, Bernego and Perez claim that the problem with the theory that separate the theoretical issues from the policy activism. And I think this is a weak critique because we need to promote our alternative policies, challenging the orthodox one. We cannot separate the theory from the proposal of new policies. We just need to prove they make sense, and we need also to get political support. And this is very important because this policy cannot be implemented just from an argument, but need political support in our country. Theory should guide these political programs. The other problem is the domestic debt burden. This is a very crucial issue because this developing country, I think that they are submerged into an international institutional framework. I am an institutional economist. And I think this is a network, a very strong network of domination and dependence. And when any country tries to disengage or to block the capital financial restriction, will face retaliation and isolation. And if there are doubts about an excessive debt burden, even in domestic currency, look at that. We can say that, well, the debt in domestic currency doesn't matter, but from the international point of view, for a developing nation, not for Japan, not from Europe, this will have an impact on capital flows that are not very easily to manage. A run against the national currency in an open market could be very fast. In just 2-3 days, you can lose your monetary reserve. For this reason, I would say domestic deficits matter and should be monitored, given these restrictions from an international standpoint. Hence, it is necessary to tackle expansive fiscal policy in domestic currency, very carefully, very well planned and targeted, and keeping an eye on the external constraint. The balance of payment constraint also, as we have this limited sovereignty, and that's the reality in developing nations, we need to manage this current account balance very carefully, and we need to have a good level of international reserve. We need to shield them with an active monetary policy. And in the case of exchange rate, capital controls and fixed exchange rate are not really a good idea, but they should be subjected to dirty flotation and has to be managed by an intelligent intervention of the state. If it is possible, capital control should be avoided except in extreme cases. Deficit in this current account could be accepted during short periods, but we should strive always for positive balances, and we need to import capital goods and key inputs in order to assure the process of the needed industrialization based on our domestic market, if it is possible, but always thinking globally. And the other issue is the real resource constraint. I would say this matters a lot. In developing nations, many problems emerge from supply problems that has to be solved with real technological capital policies and not only by demand surge. If the aggregate demand is not managed carefully, inflation can emerge easily, aggravating the current account deficit. Just floating the exchange rate, and I think some MT colleagues are very loose in this point, just floating the exchange rate could be also problematic for overcome this problem. Also, very crucial is the adequate production of agricultural goods to support the necessity of the population and the industry. The problem with this sector, especially the agriculture, is that they are plagued with institutional problems such as land concentration and low productivity that have to be solved with sectorial policies. Food security should be a target, but I am conscious that it's very hard to achieve for them. Also, energy security should be also a target, but based on alternative energy according to climate change conditions, especially in LDC, and it's going to be a very slow process. It will take time to achieve these propositions. Conclusions. My point is that MMT theory can and should be implemented in developing countries, but it has to take into account the previous restrictions and need to be promoted with a careful design. It also needs political and institutional support to be feasible. And this is crucial. If the population does not understand this issue, it will be very easily convinced by the neoclassicals about inflation and all of that. And also, we must understand they are not once and for all solution. They open the opportunity to expand the role of the state policies under a creative vision that has to be grounded in our international realities. Otherwise, it could lead to a problematic road. In some cases, even though we don't have complete monetary sovereignty, we can use a margin based on healthy levels of reserve and prudential trade policies, taking opportunity of the space available to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Parada. I totally agree with your position about MMT and the needed development in terms of utilizing it as a tool for looking at the realities of countries that are very specific, right? Because also the Global South is not just a region of the world that is homogeneous, but rather has its own specificities. So thank you very much for opening the room for this reflection that we haven't had in a long time. So it's time to introduce the following speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Claudia Maya. She has a PhD in economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She has a master in economics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. and a master's in finance from the Faculty of Accounting and Administration of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She belongs to the National System of Researchers and is responsible for the project titled Banking Reconfiguration, Monetary Circuits and Financial Innovation, New Processes of Financialization in North America. Dr. Maya is also the author of the book Financialization, Securitization and Crisis, The American Experience, and multiple articles and chapters in books in Mexico and abroad. She has also participated in different national and international seminars and conferences, and she currently serves as a full-time researcher at the North American Research Center and as an undergraduate and graduate professor at the Faculty of Political and Social Science in UNAM. So it is my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and a former colleague at UMKC, Dr. Claudia Maya.
Thank you very much, Carol, Fadhel, and JAIRO. It's my pleasure to having you here this afternoon. And it's like having classes together with Ray at 11 p.m. on Mondays. So I'm so happy to hear your presentations. Well, now I'm going to present my own, that is, let me share my, wow, let me see where is it? I just have it open before to check something and now I don't see it. Oh, hold on. I just have it and I don't know if I close it or what I did. Yes, I just give me a second, please. Hold on. Instead of open it, I close it. Share screen. Here it is. Can you see my presentation? Well, I'm going to start by telling you that it's a good point to be the last one in presenting because I can recollect some good points from the previous presentation, but I still have my own point of view about the implications of MMIT. I want to present this case for my country, Mexico, and how UMSCA or NAFTA previously has imposed limits even on thinking about MMIT. So the objective of this presentation is to show the UMSCA process for Mexico. The second objective is to observe some outcome of the openness of Mexican economy. And the third one is to highlight the need for full employment policies. First, I want to mention, as has been mentioned also here, is the orthodox economists advocate for the increasing in foreign trade, foreign investment, and the availability of financing, believing that it will contribute to employment and economic growth. And I have to be very emphatic with these points because I heard some of these arguments, so I identify some of these points in the presentation that were before me. So the advancing globalization, including regulatory convergence and trade agreements, will allow to take advantage of productive conditions in a global economy in mutually beneficial relationship. Also, it's an orthodox argument. But the outcome for Mexico had been different. All the points that Fadhel mentioned about this globalization, we have experienced 30 years ago. The NAFTA was signed in 1994, but the opening of Mexican economy started at the late 80s. So we can tell you that Mexico has a network of 46 agreements and 16 commercial treaties that give access to a billion potential customers. The most important has been the NAFTA, now it's UMSCA. And this UMSCA became the legal regime of trade, but also a legal regime for investment for North America. This is a very important point, because this is the linkage to North America. In the North America area, we don't have a common money or a common currency as Europe has, but we are very integrated to trade, but to investment. That's important. Another point we have that NAFTA created one of the largest free trade area in the world. It currently holds 482 millions, and that represent around 7% of world population. It generates 88% of gross domestic product or GDP and represents 6% of world trade. So the North American integration is not a cookie, it's not a piece of cake. It represents an important area where services, trade and capital movement take place. Mexico export in previous NAFTA about $313 million that represent 80% of all our exports to the area. Import from Mexico by United States and Canada were almost 50% of total import before COVID pandemic. So we are very integrated to North America, but especially to United States, as we will see later. Okay, UMSCA represents almost 50% of the gross domestic product for Mexico. So it's a lot. It's a lot to hold, just to adopt our own independent policy or macro policy to grow. So everything in Mexico is points to export and to the United States economy, basically. The United States is the main destination for our Mexican export, represent around 81%. Canada only represents the 3%. So in fact, what gives dynamics to the North America region is the United States. Without it, it doesn't have any sense, the integration. China is the other important partner in the trade with Mexico, and Mexico has a surplus with the United States, but a great deficit with China, as we can see in this graph. Most of our trade is with the United States and China, and basically is null with Canada. I want to show this graph that was very interesting for me. As Mainstream said, that we needed to open our economy and to have more trade and more international trade, more export, more imports. But as this trade, that is the blue line, grows, the GDP decreases in Mexico. So there is a really direct relationship between openness and low rate of GDP, at least for the Mexican case. We also have that perhaps the most relevant aspect of the UMSCA is what established in Chapter 33 in response to the macroeconomic stability as main target. So in the new UMSCA, there is an important, very important chapter where it is privileged, where exchange rate is the central point. The new UMSCA requires the no manipulation of the exchange rate and to maintain macroeconomic stability as fundamental objective of the Mexican economic policy. And this act also forces the commercial partners to observe the guidelines of the International Monetary Fund to avoid manipulation of exchange rate. But this exchange rate depends basically on the market conditions. In Mexico has been the last years about 19 to 20 pesos per dollar. But here it is our tide. We are under constraint on the monetary policies, and we cannot even control or manipulate our exchange rate because this is established in the mandatory way at UMSCA. So foreign investment also has a great part in this deal, in this trade agreement. As I told you at the beginning, it's not just a trade deal, but also an investment deal. And foreign investment has a great influence in the exchange rate, appreciation or depreciation in the case of Mexico. On the other hand, conventional theory also states that a developing country needs to improve productivity to be international competitive or devalue its currency to increase export currency manipulation, but also we have seen the chapter 33 prohibit this manipulation. Mexico cannot access any of these options, so we don't have developed our internal markets and to have our own investment in capital. We have been very, very dependent on export, but with low value, and import but not even a lot of import in capital, investment in capital. Basically, the big corporations are the ones who make intra-firm transactions and who transfer technology and also this kind of investment on capital, but it's not for Mexico. It's for these big corporations that didn't hurt, that you mentioned, guys, before, and actually they are who design the macro policy for my country and for developing country, basically. So we don't have that independency to design our own macro strategies or macro policy. We are obliged to keep this macro stability with exchange rate stable and also with interest rate dependent from the Fed decisions. So we have here how the exchange rate have reaction. So we have some important devaluation, but in general, the central bank has maintained the value of peso constant. What we can see here in this graph is foreign direct investment and portfolio investment in Mexico. As you can see, we have had a lot of entrants from abroad, basically American investment and some European investment. Of course, China also invests in Mexico, but it hasn't been stable. It varies according to the markets. And portfolio investment has been also very important. Sometimes even the inflows are greater than for indirect investment. But anyways, for indirect investment and portfolio investment behave the same way because for indirect investment doesn't invest to expand capacity in my country, but to acquire public corporations. So in those days, in those years where or indirect investment came to Mexico, was basically to acquire public firms. Here we have another important things. Portfolio investment has been directed to buy governmental bonds. So even if those bonds could be acquired by nationals, most of the internal debt in Mexico is in hands of portfolio investors. So it doesn't, you don't have this difference between external debt and internal debt, because they also became more or less the same, but are in hands of international investors and are paid in dollars. So Mexico have very low margin of reaction in this way. Just to make this point that MMT established that, well, doesn't matter how much government is in debt as long as it is in pesos. But I can tell you with this graph that internal debt is paid also in dollars as external debt. And we can see this as long as, okay, let me see, as long as portfolio investment enters, the indebtedness of Mexican government debt increases. That's a very interesting point, because the indebtedness of federal government in Mexico is not to finance the deficit to invest in Mexico, but to pay more debt. So Mexican government is constantly in Ponzi position, getting debt to pay debt. This is the history of GDP in Mexico. So we can see that previous NAFTA, Mexico had reached important growth levels, but with the openness of our economy and with NAFTA, we have had several crises and less GDP levels. So the last one now is very, very deep. The crisis and the growth of GDP is negative. We have had in 2020 around minus 10%, and that is very. How can I put it on the table? This is a very painful situation for the population, because the contraction of the GDP has been not just in the product and trade, but also in employment. So the social and economic situation in Mexico was aggravated before COVID pandemic. So this decline in GDP is not just the result of COVID pandemic, but also from the policies and the openness of the economy. The pandemic will transform all social life and the economy as we know it now, from labor practices, education, business organization, government agencies, consumer and investment trends, and more. But social sectors have been the most affected, and the government has not been able to respond as it is required. Mexican government has only designated 1% of GDP to face pandemic. And I can tell you that United States has designated about 1/3 of its GDP to face pandemic. Mexico has imposed austerity policy constantly because it is required for these NAFTA agreements. The capacity of employment generation that Mexico had before the COVID crisis was limited. 55% of population in condition of works in the informal sector. That means that we have very few percentage working with decent conditions and decent salaries, because most of the population works in the informal sector with any kind of warranty or service, even very low paid. That means that 55% of Mexicans are in this situation, that are around 31 millions. This data has been increased with the pandemic, and full employment program, of course, are required to reactivate the economy and to create disposable income. And some studies have been done that this program of this policy, because it's more than a program, will cost around 6.8 Mexican GDP. Unfortunately, in Mexico, we don't have the institutions nor the political agreement, and even the society is against expanding. They are more pro-austerity policies, no? And they support the program that the president is promoting, arguing that this policy is fighting bad attitudes or bad expenses. Though the only thing this policy has generated is to contract the GDP and increase the unemployment conditions in Mexican population. Mexico faces external constraints, of course, since we are an open economy that depends on trade and financial capital movement. It limits the monetary sovereignty that could found and promote full employment policy that we desperately required. So it's what what limits MAT theories in a country that is plenty integrated to hegemonic power and hegemonic economy, not just from the area, but also from the world. And we have a double monetary circuit. That means that some payments are made in pesos, but mostly are made in dollars. So to break with this system is not as easy as Fadhel could think, at least for Mexico, that is completely integrated to the North America, but also with the expansion of financial markets. Financial markets have play a very important role in shaping monetary policy, because basically the Bank of Mexico is always fighting inflation. The main objective of central bank is to fight inflation in order to keep rentability in financial markets, but it has generated a lot of problems for Mexican economy since having a strong peso and having a lot of entrance of international flows constantly generates financial crisis. When those inflows just go out, they just keep just throw the peso in one day or one day from another. So that's another constraint in this MIT functions in a country like Mexico. So I will leave it here and open the AQ questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Wonderful presentation. And thank you, JAIRO. I also would like to thank KAROL, who had to leave to teach her class for joining us for the first hour. And I'd like to invite you, Claudia and JAIRO, to turn on your camera and join us for a conversation, for Q&A, for discussion.
Sure.
I'll ask you, Claudia, and the rest of the UNAM team to see if there are any relevant questions from the chat, either on YouTube or Facebook or here on Zoom. But in the meanwhile, I wanted to start with a quick follow-up comment on your last point, Claudia, which I think is important, and to bring us into kind of a conversation about inflation and the role of central banks, because I think in the mainstream theory and the mainstream framework has hijacked the conversation about the role of central banks in inflation targeting. And the Bank of Mexico actually just produced a wonderful report maybe a month ago, very detailed report about the sources of inflation in Mexico, and went through a long list of sources of inflation and what they identified. And there are several studies actually over the last 10 years about the sources of inflation. And what did they find? The most common sources of inflation are energy imports, food imports, global supply chain. All of these factors that actually drive inflation are way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. There's nothing the central bank can do to convince global food producers to lower their prices. So inflation targeting via monetary policy tools are useless, essentially. In Tunisia, the major source of inflation are wheat imports and oil imports. Their prices are determined by OPEC, by the Ukraine, by Australia. There's nothing the Tunisian central bank can do other than accepting how financial markets have hijacked their policy, convincing them you need austerity, you need to raise interest rates, you need to stabilize exchange rate for their benefits. And nothing structural is being done with the actual sources of inflation. And that's why we have to work on both fronts. MMT recognizes this, recognizes that, yes, you need a state-led development policy a la 1960s, updated for our context today, that targets kind of the big push in agricultural policy, industrial policy, and sequenced investments that target the sources of those structural weaknesses, but at the same time, go after the hijackers, those who actually hijack central bank policy, financial markets, and use your tools, your regulatory tools, use your capital controls, use your regulatory controls in order to fight the speculators and euthanize the rentiers.
But the thing here is in a world with the dominance of finance, you can do that because the ones who rule the world are those big like BlackRock or other big companies, big financial companies. And we depend as a country from those calificadoras like Fidelity, like other ones, that if they give you a bad grade, you just don't have access to credit.
So what do we do, Claudia? Do we surrender and let them
No,
rule?
of course not, But we have to change some things also. Sure. I mean, we have to recognize our environment. We have to recognize our limits, and from that, operate. I know, Jairo, do you have any comments before we start with a Q&A session?
Yes, I agree with what Fadhel said, that the central bank, they cannot do much. I mean, it's like a ridiculous game. For example, in my country, we are still in the recovery, and we have a discount rate of 1.75. And the only thing they did was to increase this discount rate to 2. And that's it. Nothing more. That doesn't make any difference in the short run. But I have a question to you, Claudia, because I was surprised by the numbers you gave for the Mexican government facing the pandemic. How do you explain that 11 like AMLO's presidents spend too low, even lower in my country, which is a very conservative
lower. That's
in
why
facing the pandemic.
I wanted to make this point, because we have the austerity policy in Mexico has been even worse with the previous with the right parties. I mean, this has been the main policy, austerity in Mexico. And the results have been disastrous. Even if we have a left-wing president, we still hold the austerity as a policy. Yes.
Yeah,
Great.
Even presumably progressive administration is completely, engulfed by mainstream ideas when it comes to how do you manage the economy. And this has been true, as you both know, in Latin America for decades. Leftist governments sometimes getting lucky with high commodity prices and going with generous kind of populist spending programs. And as soon as international commodity prices turn against them, they're out. And they waste the opportunity to structurally build capacity in food security and energy security and industrial capacity. So they ride kind of the wave of good luck during high commodity prices, and then they get hit with severe external debt and depreciation and austerity measures when commodity prices turn against them.
Okay. Well, I don't know. We can start with the Q&A session. We have one. We see Jose de Jesus hiding hands. So, Jose, do you have a question or you have collected questions? I don't know.
No, those are my questions.
Okay, go on.
Hello, everybody. I'm the student.
He is my student, by the way.
Thank you for the excellent presentations from all of for you three guys. And my first question is for Dr. Kaboub, and it's about in countries like Mexico, especially, which have their own currency, but they also have a lot of foreign debt. Here we have a lot of dollar-denominated debt. In which case, well, I argue that Mexico in pesos especially don't have a financial constraint, but in case of deficit spending, how long will inflation kick in after we start spending? Because it's implied in MMT that it will be, we have like a less wiggle room than countries like the US or Japan, etc. And the second question is for Dr. Maya, that what are your recommendations to reform in financial regulation in Mexico, especially in the case of government bonds, which there has been some changes recently.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you.
I'll start with the first question. About the question is, after the spending, domestic spending, say in Mexico, how long will it take until inflation kicks in? What's the capacity? So I'll start with the first point. Any spending has potential inflation risks associated with it, whether it's spending by the government, by households, by the private sector. So any spending will increase demand for certain products within the system and could potentially lead you to that inflation constraint that I talked about earlier, which is the shortage or availability of productive capacity or abusive market power in certain areas of the economy. Let's keep things simple. Let's say the Mexican government wants to spend 5 billion pesos over the next 2 years to hire workers to construct new highways, new ports, new infrastructure for the country, hypothetically. You're going to pay workers decent wages, right? You're going to buy construction materials and so on. What will those workers that the government just hired do with their income? They're going to go buy food, entertainment, transportation. It's a free country. They buy stuff that they want to support their family. All of a sudden, demand for food imports is going up. Demand for cell phones imported from the US is going up. Demand for all kinds of imports will increase, which means you have more pressure on the exchange rate, which means you're going to have a risk of either more external debt or risk of imported inflation. So any spending will have a risk of inflation. That's why in the MMT framework, we always say you have to always spend with an eye towards the risk of inflation, which means instead of spending 5 billion pesos on construction of ports and roads and airports, maybe you should spend only 2 on that infrastructure project and dedicate the other 2 or 3 billion to building productive capacity in the areas of inflation pressure points that you have in the Mexican economy. whether it's energy, whether it's housing, whether it's food, so that you're simultaneously building productive capacity and reducing the need for imports, and also spending strategically in areas that are needed, such as infrastructure, health, education, whatever it is. So that's the part of my presentation where I said you can spend more to reduce inflation, as opposed to the mainstream approach, which says anytime the government spends, it will automatically cause inflation. It could cause inflation. In terms of the speed of how quickly that inflation can happen, it can be pretty quick, especially for countries that are very vulnerable in terms of food needs and energy needs, that it immediately applies pressure on your exchange rate. So that's really the strategy, is not to spend as if nothing matters. You have to spend carefully in order to break the source of inflation, target the source of inflation. That's why I said earlier, central bankers are useless in inflation targeting, because the power of the fiscal authority to spend more, target the source of inflation, tax and regulate abusive price setters, that's how you break inflation, and that's how you expand the fiscal capacity of the state. But central bankers are hijacked by financial markets who convince them you need to target inflation via austerity policies and interest rate policies and exchange rate stability, and listen to what credit rating agencies are saying. What I suggested earlier in terms of how you target your fiscal spending to reduce the risk of inflation over time, that in and of itself will liberate you from the hijacking situation that you have in financial markets. Because when you reduce the actual sources of inflation, you strengthen your exchange rate, you increase your foreign currency reserves, and those rating agencies will give you a better rating. So that's how you liberate yourself from them, because they are also trapped in a neoclassical model of economic development that says austerity is the only way to grow your economy and be fiscally sustainable. And we're saying you're shooting yourself in the foot. So that's kind of my take on this. Thank you.
That's very interesting what you, Fadhel, said. But I have to remind you guys that we have a very open economy where the capital flows are constantly going back and forth. And those are who set your exchange rate, and also who promote or who fix the interest rate. So you are not that independent. When you say you have to, who you are considering, whether the government, the private sector, who is a very interesting question for me. But let me just
sorry, I didn't hear the question.
When you said you have to, who you are referring? The government, Mexican government, Tunisian government, Colombian government, or private sector, national private sector?
It is a government. It is a government. Ideally, a democratic government that understands what it's doing.
All right. Well, just to answer Jose Bermudez's question, I have to emphasize this point. We have to re-regulate the financial system in just limit who can invest and in what to invest. So the government has to be very focused on that, and just limit who is going to acquire national bonds, or Mexican bonds, and force people to receive interest in pesos and receive the la renta in pesos. Force them to do it, and not in dollars. That makes a big difference. Okay, se fue our friend, se fue Jairo. I don't see him anymore. Well, Emilio, can you read please the questions on the chat? Who's supposed to be reading the questions on the chat?
I can go ahead and read some of the questions until Jairo joins us maybe in a second.
All right.
I see some questions for me, so I'll just go ahead and answer them.
Please.
I'll start with the one in front of me. I think it's Mariam this is from Giovanni, I think, is asking, what's the best path to stop the oil dependency and transition to renewable energy in countries like Colombia? And how would this impact the economy? So the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which is critical, as I suggested earlier, in terms of building energy security internally. There's a couple of things. One is you have a substantial amount of subsidies already given to the oil and gas companies in most countries. So you start shifting those subsidies away from continuing the extraction and production and distribution of fossil fuels and building capacity, productive capacity in solar, wind, geothermal, and so on. And you do it gradually. That means importing the technology, because most countries in the global south don't have access to that technology. So this is where your global south strategic partnership that I mentioned earlier can be critical. And this means partnering with countries that already have some of the technology and the productive capacity, especially India and China in particular, China, I should say, first. But if necessary, with countries in the global north, like Germany and other major producers in the United States. But it has to be based on building resilience and capacity in the global south for the global south, because there's a huge effort now, especially in the European Union, to use Africa in particular as a place where renewable energy is produced for European consumption, not for African development, not for African energy independence. So that can't be the solution. In terms of who will stand in your way when you attempt to do this, you have to recognize that most countries that import a lot of petrochemicals, gasoline and kerosene, even countries that export their own fossil fuels, by the way, they import gasoline and kerosene and petrochemicals. The importers, who often happen to be oligarchs and very powerful business people and corporations, have no interest in seeing a domestic renewable energy competitor take their market share. So those are going to be your most vicious, the most vicious defenders of fossil fuels, because they have a monopoly. They have an abusive market position that's given to them sometimes via corruption, or accumulate market power and political power over time via corruption. So those are the real targets of how you build your domestic renewable energy capacity. The last question I see here from Ian, I believe, is asking me also if there is an example of countries that apply the propositions that I presented in this seminar. The short answer is not yet. We're working with a number of developing countries just in the last year who are finally recognizing that the economic development model that they've been following, which is the neoliberal, extractive, export-oriented, tourism-based models, have been extractive and abusive and are kind of leading us towards the cliff. And I see increasingly more policymakers in the global south recognizing that that model is failing. And the COVID crisis simply highlighted this for a lot of countries. In terms of moving into the next step of using a different approach to economic development, all the constraints and obstacles that Claudia and JAIRO and myself have highlighted today are real, and policymakers in the global south recognize those. So how do you escape that hijacking situation of financial markets? How do you escape the power of former colonial corporations that still dominate your economy? How do you actually transition from not having food security and being literally dependent for your life on imports from the global north for food in particular and fuel, into building domestic resilience and self-sufficiency? These are very challenging on an institutional, international political economy standpoint, and from a technical and natural resource perspective. But what we're showing is that there is a pathway out of these traps, and that's where the hard work is how do you drive through that path. And I can't share specific details about particular countries, but a couple of days ago, we had a panel with Stephanie Kelton, myself, and Ambassador Marlene Moses from the Republic of Nauru about the economic development strategies that we've been working with we've been working on with the Republic of Nauru. But there are other governments, and hopefully in the next year or so, you'll see a lot more thinking and speaking and engagement with countries in the Global South about these pathways. And Jairo, welcome back. We have questions for you.
Yes, we have one question from Emilio Alba to you. Emilio, do you want to read your question, please? I know that this is for Jairo.
Well, I want to ask, first, I'm grateful for your presentation, but I would like to ask if, well, for example, in the USA Recovery Act, and all these discussions about mining the coin and that, and all the political resistance who is in USA, how you could apply an MMT policy in a country like USA, talking about the cultural and all these social factors that, how I can say, affect the decisions and all the policy making. It's possible to make the MMT in a country that is, how to say, is that constrained about debt and all these questions?
Well, I would say the MMT in the US is a political agenda at federal level, but the expenditure policy can be implemented through regional policies. I mean, picking state by state, looking at the priorities, which are very different in the East, in the Midwest, and in the West. The requirements of every state are very different. So once you set the target at the federal level, you can decompose through carefully planning state by state, and then struggle with each state through these policies where the federal government offers grants and the state collaborate with these grants and to implement this policy according to the priorities of each state. It could be implemented. The problem is that we economists have forgotten all this training in regional policies. Even this class has been forgotten. I mean, development planning is not being taught in the US. Nobody cares about that. But this is the MMT agenda, as Fadhel shows, requires a careful planned agenda at the federal level and the state level. It's a very careful process. And the way economics is taught today goes against that. Because one thing that puzzles me is, despite the huge economic crisis we have last year, and we're still going on, nothing has happened in economics department. They are not changing. They keep teaching the same thing. I would say it's a sociological problem of knowledge, status, and power. They don't want to change anything. They think the theory is right, that they have this deviation last year, and now through austerity policies, they are going to correct them again this year and next year. So the problem that we have in the economic department is this close-minded that nothing has happened. They keep teaching the same macro and micro classes in the same way, and they deviate through technical issues like these three Joseph problem, econometrics, comparisons, experiments called naturals in econometrics to see if the sectoral policies work. But we are losing the whole point of the main purpose of economics is to solve people's problems. But this is not the issue that prevails in the economics department today. But it can be done. I mean, just study the whole process of the Great Depression, and you pay attention to all these policies during the during the Roosevelt administration, you go through a whole literature showing how was designed very carefully, state by state. And there is much to learn from it. There are books about it, but nobody look at that. And now that we're talking with the new Green Revolution, this is something that we need to do again.
I completely agree with you, JAIRO, on this point about the economics profession, especially in the US, which dominates economics in general. And case in point, Milton Friedman and Hayek and the neoliberals, they didn't win the debates in academic journals. They actually lost all the debates, the capital debates and all of that. But where did they win? They win in the public domain with the narrative that took advantage of the crisis of the 70s, the stagflation. And theory didn't matter. What matters is that they had a lot of people who are in a vulnerable position, a lot of people who were suffering economically, working class people, and they convinced them that they have a different way of running the economy that's based on freedom and liberty and free markets, and the state is the problem and too much welfare spending is the problem. Even though the inflation of the 70s had nothing to do with the state or workers in the US or anything, it was a crisis in the Middle East that drove oil prices. But that reality didn't matter. So they captured the narrative and they took advantage of the situation, and they won, so to speak, in the public domain, in the streets, with the hearts and minds of people. And they had a very charismatic president, Reagan, very charismatic and powerful prime minister in the UK that kind of pushed the political narrative with that ideology. I think we need to learn from that lesson of the 1970s and 1980s today, that there is no way we're going to win this battle in academic journals. As far as I'm concerned, we have more than 2 decades worth of publications. They completely ignore them. They don't care to read them. They completely misrepresent MMT views clearly. Today when MMT is in the public domain, most mainstream economists, is very clear they either haven't read a single piece or are intentionally misrepresenting MMT and saying, oh, MMTers, they want to print money. We tried this in Venezuela. We tried this in other places. Look where they are, which is the shallowest of critiques you can provide for MMT. So they're completely dismissing MMT on the academic front. Where is MMT gaining traction and getting support? It's in actually policy circles in US Congress with policymakers who are actually looking for practical solutions to deal with climate change, to deal with unemployment, poverty, neglect in so many parts of the country, and to deal with risks of inflation in ways that are different than the standard approach that the mainstream approaches. So slowly and gradually, we're getting public policy attention. Slowly and gradually, we're getting mainstream media attention. Because when you think of mainstream media, independent journalists and financial journalists and business journalists, they're not professional economists. They listen to Larry Summers. They listen to Stephanie Kelton. Larry Summers doesn't make sense. Stephanie Kelton is making more sense. So they say, okay, we're going to listen to more Stephanie Kelton.
Not always.
Keep asking questions. So we're gradually getting mainstream media and mainstream kind of public more and more engaged with MMT, getting the nuances. And that's how we're going to win this battle. It's not going to be winning the debate with Larry Summers or with the American Economic Review.
But an exercise very interesting we can do is in the classroom, as we were the first experiment to this MIT many years ago, and we can just reproduce it with our students. Actually, most of my students are very well aware of MIT in Mexico, and not in economic faculty, but in the social science and political science, where they don't have this chip. So it's good.
Yeah. And this is something that I'm glad that we have UMKC people here on the panel. For people who think that the biggest critics of MMT are mainstream economists, I can tell you from experience, the biggest critics of MMT were UMKC graduate students in the classroom.
Yeah, it was
because most of us were from the global south, and most of us were challenging the approach on exchange rate, inflation, economic development. So this is not something that we've ignored or neglected. This is something that's been core and central to all of our debates and work for more than 20 years now.
Yes. There is one more question for you, Fadhel. Is Ian Slaughter? Can you read, please, Fadhel? I think you can understand better than my English.
The question from Ian, I answered it earlier. That's the one.
Okay.
Yeah, I answered Ian's question. Yeah, thank you.
Is there any other question? I don't know if we have on YouTube or any other comment. So I have one more idea. What about this Kregel's idea of South-South currency union? If not currency union, just currency trade with an special, not with dollars, not with yens, but with a special currency. Yeah. What do you think, Fadhel? What do you think, JAIRO?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on this, because this is, we didn't get a chance to say more about South-South strategic partnerships, but obviously when you can build a regional currency union in the global South, but build it with an institutional design like the Eurozone with austerity rules, which will be destructive, obviously, or you can design a common currency in a South-South strategic partnership bloc based on the principles that I described earlier, which is thinking primarily on building food security, energy security within the trading bloc. And having access to a larger consumer base is important for industrial development. Having access to complementary resources and capabilities is important. So within that framework, with the policy of collective resilience and state-led economic development within the bloc, sure, you can have either a single currency, or you can have swap lines within the bloc that stabilize exchange rates. And I want to say a couple of words about swap lines. Notice the 2008 financial crisis, notice the COVID crisis. One of the first things that central banks in the global North did is a press release immediately saying swap lines with the ECB, Bank of Switzerland, Bank of Japan. And it was extremely effective at stabilizing financial systems and stabilizing exchange rates with those countries. There was a handful, a very small group of developing emerging countries that took advantage of swap lines because they were privileged enough to be, friends with the U.S. or friends with countries in the global North to have swap lines. Mexico is one of them, and it took advantage of the swap line, and it did help. These swap lines are exclusive. They need to be much more prevalent, either at the regional level, at the global level, because that's one way to support the transition away from this austerity-based mode of economic development, because we do need support in that transition, and the global North can help. So those swap lines can be part of the solution. SDRs can be part of the solution, right? And loans or grants that are not imposing austerity, but loans and grants that really focus on building productive capacity to give developing countries more resilience over time, as opposed to austerity that keeps us in those traps. So that's my take on this.
JAIRO?
Well, I would think that looking at the international experience in Latin America, we are very far from that. I mean, the Andean Pact and the Latin American Agreement is in
we lost you. Okay.
It's a political one. We have strong difference in the political side. You look at Venezuela, Nicaragua, and all these countries compared with other Latin American countries. So I would be very skeptical to expect some currency unions today. We are very far from that. Maybe in the 60s, 70s, we were getting closer to that. But today, I wouldn't put that on the agenda. We need to change the political position with each country, to use in a better way our own currency, to integrate more in trade with with neighboring countries, with Africa and East Asia, but it's a process will take many years.
So we will continue in the same path as we have done with the North. KAIRO?
Well,
so what's the difference?
We are very far from that. I mean, looking at what's going on in the European Union with all this problem with Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, the European Union is full of problems right now. So I would say we need to be very cautious in this kind of utopian path and rely more in our own efforts, very carefully, because the situation today in the world is very complicated.
Yeah, the political reality is that, you know, it's hard enough to find, you know, a government administration in one country that's focused strategically on doing the things that we're talking about domestically, let alone finding a large group of them who agree to do this collectively. So I agree with you, JAIRO, that the political realities, unfortunately, are not there yet. The level of consciousness in strategic thinking is not there, because most governments are so busy putting out fires left and right, thinking, are we able to pay the salaries next week? Are we able to import food next week? They're not thinking 5, 10 years, 20 years ahead. And that's why when you're in a trap, you don't have the room to breathe and think carefully about the long term. You're just dealing with survival. And that's the unfortunate reality. And to your point, Claudia, earlier about the power of larger countries like the US, like the EU and so on, this is what makes a difference between countries that have strategic plans thinking for the next 50 to 100 years. And a handful of countries do that. That's China, that's the US. They're thinking about their global influence long-term versus many of countries in the global South that have no strategic vision for themselves beyond kind of really short-term approach. And if that's going to be the case, you're always going to be part of somebody else's strategic plan. They're going to draw the puzzle for the whole world and fit you where you belong, which is extract resources, be a market for their exports, and be a source of exploitation for labor, for nature, for financial markets. And if we accept that, then we just give up. If we don't, then we have to at least think long terms, not to the point where we can compete with the US or displace China or displace Europe, because you can't do that. But at least you have a strategic vision for yourself and try to fit it within the global political economy and play your cards, because the US is not your only global power. EU is not your only global power. China is not your only global power. So play your economic diplomacy carefully and play it collectively with other small countries so that you get something out of these relationships.
But one example of what you're saying is UMKC or NAFTA. They have institutionalized these patterns, this trap. So when your country is willingly and eager to sign it,
sure.
What did you do?
Well, that's why I said earlier, if you don't have a minimum level of resilience, you can't walk away from negotiation table. You can't say this doesn't work for me. You have to accept it. And we have the only way to have some bargaining chips in those negotiations to the point where you say, I'm sorry, this doesn't work for me, is to have a basic level of resilience. Otherwise, your people will starve the next day. So that's why your economic development strategy must start with building that minimum level of resilience. And then you can untangle the power of these international agreements and how they've been institutionalized. But without that, there is no way out of these traps.
Very well. Well, it has been a pleasure to have you all, especially JAIRO and Fadhel.
Thank you.
It was
thank you, Claudia, for the invitation.
And we have, it is not the last one. Even if it's hard for us, we are following you in English. But next time we will request Fadhel to speak Spanish and JAIRO and myself in Spanish. everything.
Okay.
So it's going to be clear.
Okay.
Well, let's join again. I don't know, whenever we are an opportunity to make another webinar very interesting. And now we can focus on a specific thing, maybe climate change, maybe financing, maybe development.
Sure.
And keeping applying MIT principles if it's possible, or critics, or make critics about it. So I think if there is not any other question or comment, we are closing this first webinar that I think it was a home run, very, very interesting, and a lot of good ideas and insights that were result from this. And thank you very much for your presentations. They were excellent. And I think we are going to close it. Thank you, guys. So
Thank
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.